Hello, everyone. You're listening to TALRadio of the Touch a Life Foundation. This is Robert Hicks, and today we're going to have a very interesting conversation with a guest. Terry FitzPatrick is the director of the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking. That's ATEST. And essentially, ATEST is a U.S.-based coalition that advocates for solutions to prevent and end all forms of human trafficking and modern slavery around the world. Terry, thanks for joining me today on TALRadio.
Pleasure to join you. Always want to take advantage of any opportunity to let people know that slavery never really ended. It just took new forms, and it exists throughout the world today.
I have to tell you, this is a topic that completely intimidates me in its size because I've gotten a sense that it's much bigger than people would ever guess. I think we're going to be able to dip our foot into learning about the mission that ATEST has. So tell us about ATEST as you can, just kind of an introductory thing. What is ATEST?
Well, ATEST is a coalition of 17 of the leading anti-trafficking organizations that are based in the United States, although they do work throughout the world. And the goal is to get the United States government to strengthen anti-trafficking laws and to increase funding for anti-trafficking programs, both domestically inside the United States and around the world. And the different organizations that make up the ATEST coalition come from lots of different directions at the problem of human trafficking. So we have shelter providers, we have labor organizers, we have people who train police and judges about anti-trafficking laws. We have international development experts. We have the United Way. We have a branch of the AFL-CIO, the Solidarity Center. We have doctors who train other doctors what to look for if someone who is a trafficking victim might show up in an emergency room, and then what to do about that. Religious leaders. So the idea was that Congress and the White House administration need some kind of steering committee or consensus building function from the anti-trafficking leadership in the United States. And that's a function that ATEST serves. We're there to help battle it out ourselves about what's needed, and then present as best we can a consensus front as to the policies and the funding recommendations for US interventions.
So when was ATEST, the organization itself, when was that started?
In the mid-aughts, around 2007, it started, and it was started as a project through a foundation called Humanity United, based in San Francisco. And it went that way for about 10 years, and we've been an independent alliance for the past 4 years. So we've been at this for a while.
Okay. And where is ATEST? I mean, where is ATEST like headquartered at?
Well, the headquarters is in Washington, D.C., and most of the organizations are either in Washington, D.C. or have advocacy or lobbying departments that are inside Washington, D.C. But some, we have people in New York and Boston, in Los Angeles, and elsewhere. Some of our member organizations run programs in more than 30 U.S. cities. The United Way obviously runs like everywhere around the United States, and is trying to integrate anti-trafficking projects into United Way campaigns all over the country. So in a sense, we try to represent coast to coast inside the United States. And then the organizations that are part of ATEST have projects in more than 100 countries around the world.
Wow, okay. Yeah, because that's one of the things I always like to ask. What is your scope? What's your geography? And it's like everywhere, right?
Well, the problem is everywhere, so we try to be everywhere. Yeah. I mean, this is a crime, a human rights violation that is illegal everywhere, but it happens everywhere. And so you need a broad front.
Is there something that you can tell our TALRadio listeners to give them an idea of the size and scope of this problem that you're trying to attack? Because I've gotten that sense that, I was shocked to find out the degree that it exists, and then the size of it.
And
What
the
can you tell?
dimensions, because this is, I think many people have the impression that human trafficking is, and how to fight it is, Liam Neeson rescuing his daughter from the Albanian mafia after she's been kidnapped in Paris in the Taken.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yes, that may happen here or there, but that is not, and that is not the way most people end up in forced labor or bonded labor or human trafficking situations around the world. So the numbers from the International Labor Organization, part of the United Nations, say there are 40 million people today in various forms of what they call modern slavery. And this includes what you might think of as forced labor, and this would be at on fishing boats, in mines, in cocoa plantations, at rug factories, the kind of places where physical, often irregular labor is needed. That's about 21 million people around the world. About 4 million people are in commercial sexual exploitation in brothels or massage parlors or strip bars. And so it's obviously the part of the problem that everyone knows or has heard about, although it's actually a smaller slice than people who are making things that we buy every day. And then there are 15 million people that are in forced marriage, which, and this isn't just arranged marriage between underage children, say, with their parents. This is children who are sold by their parents to pay off a debt, or to forced into a marriage if a family member has died and they are given away to a brother or an uncle. So that adds up to about 40 million people. And the situation of old slavery was that people were kidnapped from Africa and brought to Europe or to the Middle East or to the Americas in slavery. Today, actually, Africa is one of the worst places for slavery. People in forced labor and in sexual exploitation inside African countries themselves. And the same is true in China and in India, where we're two of the countries with the largest actual numbers of individuals who are in trafficking situations. Lastly, governments are complicit in some situations. Prison labor in North Korea and in China is a huge problem today. Particularly, people may have heard of the Uyghur situation in China, where there are massive forced labor camps and prisons where people are manufacturing products, everything from cars and toys and clothes to solar panels and batteries that are used in the new green economy. And they're forced to do it and they aren't paid. And so there's a private sector component to it, and there's a government component to it as well.
Wow. I have to tell you, I'm very, by the way, we are getting a little bit of noise in the line. Oops. Okay, I thought it was on mute. We were getting a little bit of noise in the line, so just telling our listeners, that's coming from us. But a staggering number, 40 million. And I have to tell you what really shocked me. I was listening to a talk radio, got a political angle to it, but it was a talk radio show, and they said a number. It was exactly that number. They said there are 40 million people in slavery today, and they said in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. So that is a staggering number, because we're all so familiar, and we hear every day how our country fought to end slavery, and we kind of picture it as something way back there, right? And here we are talking about something that's contemporary and all around us, right?
We outlawed it. We didn't end it. So the 13th Amendment actually made slavery illegal, but it didn't actually fix the problem altogether. And in fact, new forms of exploitation took root in the United States almost immediately, with Jim Crow and other kinds of systems that really discriminated against the newly emancipated enslaved individuals. And so today, there are new forms, contemporary forms of enslavement. The term can be a bit problematic because people think, oh, did we end that? And the United States was not the first country by any means. It was one of the last countries to take a major step to end slavery back in the 1800s. But it still exists. It's taken on new forms. And there are two major pathways, if I might, as to how people fall into this problem. One is debt. And it's people who don't have access to credit or to banks, who live in villages or areas where they just can't borrow money if they have an emergency, like a fire has burned down their house, or there's been a motorcycle accident and someone's been hurt and they need a doctor and healthcare isn't free, or there's been a drought or an earthquake or some kind of calamity that has disrupted their lives and their livelihoods, and they need to borrow money right now from anyone who will lend it to them. And there are plenty of money brokers or mine owners or farm owners or brick factory owners who are happy to lend it to them, and then you can work it off over time. And then when you get to the work site, you realize you're in debt, bondage, slavery, forced labor, because it's a debt trap. They charge usurious interests. They don't really do very good accounting to let you know when you may have actually really paid off a debt. And so you're trapped. And the other method, and there are many ways that people get trapped into this through force, fraud, and coercion. Those are the three kind of words in the laws and the international treaties that are important here. But the other is unsafe migration. There are millions of people on the move from generally rural areas to urban areas in the developing world, or from poorer countries to richer countries internationally, in search of money to change their lives or to earn money they can send back home in remittances. In some countries, remittances from overseas make up like 15 or 20 or 30% of the country's total global income. Lots of people from India and Nepal, for example, end up migrating to Gulf countries in Dubai and Saudi Arabia and work on construction sites or work as domestic workers or work in kitchens and hospitality industries. And this is a very loosely regulated industry. And so traffickers pose as legitimate labor recruiters. And once they get you away from home, away from your legal system, away from your family, from your documents, from your cell phone, from your language, and you're now stuck thousands of miles away, you find out, oh, wait, I'm in debt again, because they say you have to pay off the airfare that brought you here. And you have to rent your blanket that you use to sleep, and you don't even earn in a day what they're charging you to take care of you in the work barracks. So those are the two biggest factors, is unsafe migration and debt bondage. And that's why so many people are trapped in this problem today, because those are two very big global challenges.
What strikes me is what you just described is something that is so much easier to slip into than what I would have ever guessed. I mean, you picture this and you say that could never happen to me, could never touch people that I know and things like that. But like when you're talking about the debt, for example, it just sounds like something that you could just overnight find yourself having slid into that and no sight that it's coming.
No, it's systemic in many ways. It isn't just a bug of our modern economic system, but it's almost a systemic flaw of our modern economic system, where people who are disadvantaged for all sorts of reasons, be those class or caste or race or religion or gender or other kinds of factors that lead to people being disadvantaged or discriminated against, that leaves them especially vulnerable economically to people who would take advantage of them. And traffickers are very smart. They know where to look. They know they always take advantage of people who are in desperate situations, or in some cases with migration, some of that migration is not an act of desperation. Sometimes people borrow thousands of dollars and they actually get visas legally to go migrate to someplace, not realizing, and they pay those fees when they probably shouldn't. I mean, really, the employer should pay to recruit their workers instead of workers having to pay to be recruited. But people take chances and go abroad. And so sometimes it's a brain drain in a sense, and not just a labor drain on a country where people take chances and not as often as not, because not everyone who migrates obviously is going to be ended up in forced labor, but it happens enough that it's 25%, actually 23%, I think it is, of those 40 million people around the world who are in modern forms of enslavement are outside their country of origin. So migration is a huge part of it.
You're now our listening audience for TALRadio is a global audience. You and I are here in the U.S., yourself in DC area, Rockville, you said, right?
Yes.
Rockville, Maryland. And I'm here in the Philadelphia metro area. And what we described so far sounds like it's over there. And so what can you tell me or tell our listening audience here in the U.S. of if and where this situation is around us here within the area where we live?
Well, sure. Let me first say before I might forget, which is we're all connected to it, even if it is over there, because we buy jewelry and clothing and food and electronics and other products that are tainted by forced labor. So we're sponsoring and financing this injustice that goes on overseas. So the there and here mix is not quite so accurate in a sense that we are connected to it in the consuming countries of our economy today. I'm going to clear my throat.
Yes.
Excuse me. So inside the United States, you find forced labor concentrated in agriculture, particularly in hand-picked vegetables. You find it in dairy, like throughout New England dairy farms and in Wisconsin and Minnesota. You find it in the sewing factories of Southern California and the garment industry. You find it inside gardening crews and construction crews, in the backs of restaurants where people wash dishes and are prep cooks and get paid daily instead of in cash and not be paid by regular kind of paycheck or bank deposits. So people in the cash economy, people in agriculture, often immigrants, and not always, but often. And so it's happening all over. There have been beef packing plants where they found forced labor. There have been chicken, poultry farms where they found forced labor. There have been big box stores in Philadelphia where you are. The U.S. Attorney broke up a ring where they were bringing in people from Eastern Europe to work on janitorial crews in Target at night. So you think, wow, is this Target? Well, maybe it's connected to forced labor because of the products on the shelves, but you don't think of hotels and large retail stores and malls that job out janitorial and landscaping services to small crews who may bring in people from overseas and trap them in forced labor to do the work. So there have been religious choirs. I'm not kidding you. There's a case of this from Texas from several years ago where there were children from Zambia who were brought in by an evangelical church, and they were kept in conditions of human trafficking, weren't paid anything, and were forced to go around the country singing as a choir. There are athletes who have come in, professional athletes, particularly in the running. I know of someone in particular who was a professional from Kenya who was a marathon runner. and was kept in a house with others, didn't get to keep his winnings or his earnings, and had his documents taken away from him. So you just wouldn't believe where you could find it. And that's on top of what we see on the news, because we always see in TV news that there have been brothels or massage studios or other places of sex work where there have been raids. So that side of it we see, but we tend to not see the part of it that's built into the kind of economic and industrial infrastructure of what just goes on every day.
Well, I have to congratulate you. You have succeeded at blowing my mind on this subject. I mean, I had a feeling that was going to happen, as I said up front. Just how this can be all around us. And like you say, we may be participating in some ways that we're completely unaware of. But I have to ask, how much of an impact or of a role has our, people call it our broken immigration system / comparatively open border, how much of a role has that played in this?
Well, there is a law that says, particularly for unaccompanied minors who come across the southern US border, they need to be screened for whether they are trafficking victims before they might be deported. And that's a very good law, and we hope to keep that on the books, despite some criticism of it. Because you can think of this as, in a large part, these are children who have escaped gang slavery, drug trade slavery, sex slavery, and other problems, particularly in Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua. And they've come to a place, our country, seeking safety. And we shouldn't send them back to their enslavers. And that's like what we used to do in the 1860s before the Civil War with the Fugitive Slave Act, is send people back if they had been fortunate enough to escape. So that's one thing that I think is important today. But there's another system that's called the H-2 system. This is a temporary guest worker system where particularly in agriculture, but also in domestic work and home healthcare workers, migrants are brought into the country, but they are tied to their employer. And they can only stay here so long as their employer approves and allows them to stay here. And this is just rife with exploitation. And because you're essentially, you can't walk away. No matter what they do to you, the option is you'll get deported. And there's no portability of that H-2 visa, guest worker visa that you might have. We'd say, listen, I'm really in forced labor working at this tomato farm. I'm going to quit and just go walk down the street and work someplace else that actually belongs to, say, the Fair Food Program or has a good reputation in farm worker circles. And the law prevents you from doing that. It keeps you in that bad situation because you don't have portability of moving your visa from one employer to another. So that's something that's broken in America's immigration system that people don't think about or talk about very much, that we have these systems that tie workers to their employers. And in many cases, an employer will say that you're a good worker, I'll re-up your, renew your visa, and then not do it. And now the person, and the person says, the worker says, I thought you renewed my visa, and they have no way of checking. And they might have a way of checking, but it's incredibly complicated. If you ever try to check someone's green card or visa status, it's not easy to do. And so now they're out of status and undocumented and so-called an illegal immigrant or undocumented immigrant of no fault of their own. Forced to overstay by being tricked, forced fraud or deception by an individual who essentially now is their trafficker. And so there are flaws in the system. They aren't always the flaws that we hear about in the news, but there's plenty of work that needs to go on. My coalition, ATEST, has been working with Congress. It's actually passed the House and it's passed the Senate, but not in the same Congress. So we're trying to get them to get together in the same session of Congress to pass the regulation of foreign labor recruiters. This will go a long way to solve some of the problems with immigration-related trafficking inside the U.S. We have a model bill that's circulated right now inside the Senate staffers, and we're looking for some answers.
Okay, so you've gotten into, because I know we talked a whole lot about the problem and how broad it is and how local it can be and all that. I wanted to get on to a little bit of the more hopeful side of what is being done. What is your organization doing to at least try to make things better? Give us an idea of some of that. I know you just touched on it with that regulation of foreign labor recruiters.
Oh, sure.
What other kinds of things?
Well, the good news is that the United States, by and far, is spending more money and has a more comprehensive anti-trafficking program than almost anywhere else in the world. And that just isn't to address forced labor and human trafficking inside the US, but across the world. And we have what's known as a whole of government approach. So there are programs, not just at the Department of Homeland Security, which deals with border issues, but at the State Department to work on trafficking problems overseas, at U.S. Agency for International Development, at the Labor Department, and elsewhere. So there are trafficking units and programs that are peppered throughout the entire United States government system. And that's great news, and because then we're hitting it on multiple fronts. We don't always live up to our ideals, and there's a lot more that needs to be done, but that is quite hopeful that we've got this foundation in place. There's a law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA. It was passed in 2000, along with something called the Palermo Protocol from the United Nations. And it is one of the most comprehensive laws, anti-trafficking laws in the world. And it creates this architecture for the United States as to what should be done at the different departments of the executive branch, and sets out spending appropriations or authorization levels for different departments. That act is up for renewal right now. Every 5 years or so, it has to be reauthorized. And there are 4 separate pieces of legislation that have all been introduced, 3 in the Senate, 1 in the House, all bipartisan, and they renew different components of the act and make improvements in many ways and increase spending in other ways. So that's hopeful that each time we reauthorize the law, we make it stronger, we make it better. We learn from what's happened in the past and infuse new ideas and new programs and new strategies to strengthen the comprehensive approach to combating trafficking. We think those bills, we hope, will pass. They will. Last reauthorization, it was passed unanimously by the Senate and with like 2 or 3 votes against in the House. So this is a bipartisan issue. There is no traffickers caucus. There's no other side to this debate. And it's just a question of just maneuvering through the legislative calendar to get things done. So everybody is in favor of this. It's just a question of, sausage works of government. So that's a very hopeful thing. The other hopeful thing is that we are every year, not just the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, but there's also federal appropriations, the annual budget that the White House comes up with a budget. Congress then has 12 bills they pass each year for the different agencies. And our ask this year is $1.3 billion across the federal government to fund all the programs from the Department of Justice to Education, to Homeland Security, and State Department, and also for those to give grants to organizations that do the work, civil society groups and nonprofits inside the US and overseas. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in grants that go out every year funded by the US government. And so that helps do the work both overseas, for example, to help mitigate some of those problems in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Honduras that are push factors. So if you get rid of trafficking in source countries, you help reduce the push of people to other countries. It helps you can work. There's both push and pull factors in migration. So working on the problem at its root causes in its root locations can be one way of helping to deal with migration related human trafficking. So that's the good news. And we have very strong champions for the spending bills. Lastly, one more thing is there's just this year, Congress passed something called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And it is groundbreaking in that it assumes that anything coming out of the Xinjiang province of China is tainted by forced labor unless proven otherwise. So they don't have to make a case at Customs and Border Protection at the dock that this shipping container or this ship full of solar panels or clothing or what have you is tainted. No, you have to prove it isn't tainted to get it imported into the United States. This is flipping the burden of proof. And now we do this with other things. You can't import medicines into the US without certificates that they're FDA approved and all that. So we're just applying the same thing, the same kind of standard to products coming from China. So this idea of using the Tariff Act to prevent goods from being brought into the US that are tainted, and in particular with high prevalence zones like the Uyghur autonomous regions in China, where we know that forced labor is just endemic throughout the manufacturing sector, to stop that stuff at the border. Well, it's very hopeful.
Wow. Can't believe how much information I'm getting here today. And like I said, I knew we weren't going to be able to do anything but just dip our foot into it. Just a reminder for our listeners that that you're listening to TALRadio of the Touch of Life Foundation. We're talking with Terry FitzPatrick, who's the director of the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, which is ATEST, ATEST. And the TALRadio is essentially the information and the entertainment arm of the Touch of Life Foundation. Touch of Life Foundation being a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization that's founded on the principle that helping others is good for society. And we leverage technologies to connect people that are in need with those that are willing to give. So my next question to you, Terry, is our listeners on TALRadio, what kind of things can people do to help ATEST? How can we help you guys out?
Well, we don't accept donations. We're not set up to do that at the moment because we're a policy coalition. So we work on grant funds from foundations that are maybe in the future. But okay. You can find out more about us at endslaveryandtrafficking.org. Endslaveryandtrafficking.org. That's our website. All our policy positions, all of these background papers. If you're interested in contributing to the work of ATEST, contribute to any one of the 17 organizations that are members. They all are set up as nonprofit charities. So you can just go to endslaveryandtrafficking.org, click who we are, and you'll see all of the different organizations that do the work and contribute to one of those. That would be one thing you can do. The other thing you could do is just spread the word. Spread the link to this podcast and spread our website to others. Have a brown bag discussion at work or in your book group. Get a book. You go to Amazon and just look for books about this, and or talk about it at your church or your temple or place of worship. Just spread the word, because this used to be legal and everyone knew it was happening and everyone could see it. And people used to think, well, this is morally acceptable and it's economically necessary. It's baked into the way things are. Imagine the early abolitionists who had to fight that kind of uphill battle, but they won. Small group of them, really, and they got slavery outlawed. And we'll succeed today if everybody does what they can today. It might seem, oh wow, 40 million people all over the world. How are we going to ever really solve that kind of systemic and broad problem? But if everyone gets aware, everyone helps spread the word, everyone does what they can in terms of contributing to the organizations who are working on the front lines, we will win, just like they won 150 years ago. Here's another couple things you can do. If you're working at a company and you procure things, you own a company and you procure things, you buy stuff, you're in the procurement chain, supply chain of your company. Ask, are the places where you get your raw materials or intermediate goods or components, are they audited for forced labor? Do they comply with any kind of sector or business standards to ensure that there's not forced labor in their supply chain? So that's something you can do if you're in the business world. And people might not know, but the more people start asking, the more it will become a selling point for people who are selling commodities and everything from cotton and cocoa to electronic components and semiconductors, whatever. If people start asking, then people realize that's a tick box I'm going to have to do on any kind of procurement contract. And maybe in your contracts, you should put that in there. A lot of times sales contracts for procurement of components and raw materials say, I agree that we are not violating anyone's trademark or other things in the sale of this materials. Why don't you say, I agree that I am not violating local laws or international conventions on forced labor in the materials that I'm selling to you. That downward pressure. So that's another thing you can do. Something else, if you're in banking or if you're just an investor with your own 401k, there are websites you can go to. Just look at socially responsible investing and make sure your retirement account is in the socially responsible investing fund and not just in the general growth fund. Or if you are an investor, there are large investment firms like Christian Brothers and others, and the Interfaith Center on Corporate Accountability actually looks into this. Forced labor is a risk. It's a liability for a company and a country. And so there are investors who will give you ideas about don't invest in those firms if they haven't taken a pledge or they're not doing auditing or if they're not part of some sector program or they have a track record of having forced labor. So that's something you can do if you're in the business or finance sectors or just have a 401k or retirement plan in the US is do what you can. So those are a few things, simple steps anyone can take.
Yeah, we're kind of coming toward the end of our conversation here. I did want to point out a couple of things. There's a page on the ATEST, ATEST website that there's a page that's called Who We Are, and there's a list of those member organizations on there, correct?
Correct.
That's a place where people can find information of where they can make contributions and help those organizations out. We certainly want to encourage those member organizations. We have a thing that is a Touch a Life Foundation app. It's a cell phone app that is called TAL Giving, TAL Giving. And so we want to ask that not only our listeners on TALRadio, but even those member organizations, download the TAL Giving app because it's a platform to help organizations that basically, whether it's people in need or people that are willing to give, to link them up. You can go to the Apple Store or the Google Play Store to get the TAL Giving app. We encourage everyone to register for that so that our listeners can contribute to those ATEST member organizations.
Thank you. Yeah, do what you can, where you can, with whomever you can. And if you're overseas and giving to a U.S. organization isn't practical, there are organizations in India or in Japan or in Australia or in the UK or elsewhere. So there are plenty of anti-trafficking organizations around the world who are on the front lines doing the work. So you can certainly just easily Google them and find organizations that you can contribute to. If you're in the US, there's a list of 17 of the ATEST member organizations that can get you going.
Yeah, well, this has been really interesting, and I'm stunned at what I've learned here. I'm sure our listeners feel the same way. And I've got a feeling with this topic being so big, so pervasive, And I mean, it's such a mountain of an effort that is required to make this go away that, we all have to think of ourselves as workers that can hopefully in some small way chip away at this mountain. And so it's, just been unbelievable hearing all this.
Yeah, that's the only way it's going to change. I mean, the other estimate is that this is a $150 billion a year criminal enterprise. That's how much illicit profits are raked in every year by traffickers. Now, imagine if we were to get rid of that skim, $150 billion of wage theft from people. That is almost a total spend of international foreign aid in the world. And so imagine if you put all that money back into poor people's pockets who are being exploited, what a lift to the global economy that would be. So do what you can, because it isn't just the good thing to do for moral reasons and out of moral suasion and out of empathy with our fellow human beings. And I've made human trafficking films in more than a dozen countries and met people who are in trafficking and who are survivors of trafficking. And they are not lost souls. They're not broken lives. These are folks who are, you just like to have over to dinner. Yes, there's a lot of trauma, and yes, there's a lot of help that people need to rebuild their lives, but they're just like you and me, and we need to help them. But aside from that moral case, there's an economic case to be made here too. This is keeping poor people down. This is keeping brown and black people down. This is discriminatory, and it's anti-women. It's actually an unfair trade practice where some countries don't enforce their trafficking laws and their products undercut the global market or businesses here at home. So it's the smart thing to do too. And there's economic reasons to do this, and not just doing it to confront the human rights abuse that it is. So I hope everyone will take some step wherever they can, whatever they can.
Yes, Terry, it's been unbelievable, and I certainly hope we'll have a chance to check in with you again sometime in the future, because so much information, so much work to do. We thank Terry FitzPatrick, the director of Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, that's ATEST, for meeting with us today to share his organization's story. We also want to thank you, our listeners, for spending time with us today, and most of all for your generous nature in following us here at TALRadio and Touch a Life. Please stay with us on TALRadio for additional uplifting stories. And again, we hope you have a great day. And Terry, thanks so much.
Pleasure.